In a quiet courtroom, nestled in a bustling city, the kind of drama that could only unfold in real life was about to begin. Judge Edward Hayes, known for his stern demeanor and unyielding dedication to the law, adjusted his glasses as he scanned the docket for the next case. To him, every case was a puzzle to be solved, a balance to be restored. The courtroom was filled with a soft rustle of papers and hushed whispers as the next defendant approached the bench. Across the room, Tanya Jefferson clutched her purse tightly and took a deep breath. She wasn't a stranger to challenges, but standing in front of a judge, especially this judge, wasn't something she had prepared for. Tanya was a pillar of her community, a beacon of hope for many. She had spent years dedicating her time and resources to helping others, but none of that seemed to matter now. Today, she wasn't a community leader or a philanthropist. She was just another defendant facing judgment. As Tanya stepped forward, the murmurs in the courtroom quieted, and all eyes turned to her. She was composed but visibly nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the hem of her neatly pressed blazer. Her presence was dignified, yet there was an undercurrent of tension in her posture. Tanya had always believed in doing the right thing, but even the most principled individuals could find themselves entangled in circumstances beyond their control. Judge Hayes glanced up from his papers, his sharp blue eyes meeting Tanya's for a fleeting moment. There was no warmth in his gaze, only the cold, calculating expression of someone who had seen it all. He was a man who believed in order, in rules, and in the power of the justice system to maintain both. To him, personal stories and intentions were secondary to the law itself. The charges were read aloud, a minor traffic violation that had spiraled into something much larger due to a series of misunderstandings. Tanya listened carefully, her lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't there to argue her innocence. She knew that much. But what hurt her most was the way people were quick to judge her character based on a single incident. "I see," Judge Hayes said, his voice calm but authoritative. He leaned back slightly, the leather of his chair creaking under his weight. "Miss Jefferson, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Tanya hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always been a confident speaker, but standing there, under the judge's scrutiny, words seemed to fail her. The courtroom waited in silence, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. I do, Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. "I'm not here to make excuses. I believe in taking responsibility for my actions. But I'd like you to understand the context of my situation." Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued, but his face revealing little. He gestured for her to continue, his pen poised to take notes. Tanya inhaled deeply and began to explain. She spoke of her work in the community, of the countless hours spent organizing charity events, feeding the homeless, and mentoring at-risk youth. She described the evening of the incident, how she had been rushing to finalize details for a major charity fundraiser when she was pulled over. It had been a moment of poor judgment, a decision made under pressure, but not one rooted in malice. As she spoke, the courtroom seemed to shift. The rigidity in her voice softened, replaced by a genuine plea for understanding. Tanya wasn't looking for pity. She was asking for fairness. For a brief moment, the walls that separated her from the judge, the spectators, and even the prosecutor seemed to crumble. Judge Hayes listened intently, his expression unreadable. He was known for being tough, but not unfair. Still, he couldn't ignore the fact that the law had been broken, regardless of the circumstances. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the edge of his desk, a subtle sign that he was deep in thought. When Tanya finished speaking, the room fell silent once more. The judge cleared his throat and leaned forward, his voice firm, but not unkind. "Ms. Jefferson, while I can appreciate your contributions to the community, my responsibility is to uphold the law. The facts of this case are clear." Tanya's heart sank. She had known this was a possibility, but hearing it still stung. The judge reached for his gavel, prepared to issue a fine and close the case, when a voice from the back of the courtroom interrupted the proceedings. "Your Honor, if I may." All heads turned to see a man standing, his face familiar to many in the room. It was clear he wasn't an ordinary spectator. Tanya's eyes widened in recognition, and a flicker of hope sparked within her. But who was he, and why was he there? Judge Hayes narrowed his eyes, clearly displeased by the interruption. "This is highly irregular," he said, his tone sharp. "State your purpose." The man stepped forward, his presence commanding yet respectful. "I believe there's more to this story than meets the eye," he said calmly, "and I think you'll want to hear it before making your final decision." The judge hesitated, the gavel hovering above the desk. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation, everyone eager to see what would unfold next. Tanya held her breath, her mind racing with questions. Could this unexpected intervention change the outcome? And if so, how? The room seemed to hold its collective breath as the judge lowered the gavel, but not to issue a fine. Instead, he leaned back, gesturing for the man to speak. The tension in the air was palpable, and everyone knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. What came next would not only challenge the judge's perception of justice, but also reveal a side of Tanya Jefferson that no one, least of all Judge Hayes, could have expected. The courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet as the man approached the front of the room. His every step seemed deliberate, carrying with it a weight of purpose. Tanya squinted, trying to place him. His face was familiar, but in the charged atmosphere of the courtroom, her mind struggled to connect the dots. Her pulse quickened as she noticed how confidently he carried himself, as if he belonged there, as if he had a reason she should trust him. Judge Hayes adjusted his glasses, peering down at the man with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "You have my attention," he said tersely. "State your name and explain your connection to this case." "My name is Eric Daniels, Your Honor," the man began, his voice clear and steady. "I'm here today because what Miss Jefferson has done for this city deserves recognition, not condemnation. And I believe this court has a responsibility to consider the full picture before passing judgment." The judge's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "And what exactly is the full picture you're referring to, Mr. Daniels?" Eric took a deep breath, his gaze shifting momentarily to Tanya. There was an unspoken understanding in his eyes, a silent reassurance that he was there to help. Tanya still couldn't quite remember where she had seen him before, but something about his presence gave her hope, a fragile glimmer in an otherwise daunting moment. "Your Honor, I've worked in community outreach for over a decade," Eric began. "In that time, I've seen my fair share of people who talk about change, and those who actually make it happen. Ms. Jefferson is one of the rare few who not only talks the talk, but walks the walk. She's the driving force behind initiatives that have transformed entire neighborhoods in this city." The judge leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled under his chin. "This court isn't a forum for character references, Mr. Daniels. If you have specific information relevant to the case, I suggest you present it." Eric nodded, unshaken by the judge's stern demeanor. "I understand, Your Honor. But with all due respect, Ms. Jefferson's character is relevant. The very event she was rushing to finalize when this incident occurred was a charity gala she organized to raise funds for underprivileged families. She didn't just plan the event, she personally secured donations, coordinated with vendors, and even paid out of pocket to make sure it would succeed. The money raised that night would provide shelter, food, and resources for hundreds of people who have nowhere else to turn. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some people exchanged glances, their skepticism softening as Eric's words painted a picture of a woman whose actions spoke louder than any mistake she might have made. Tanya stood motionless, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, unsure whether to feel relief or apprehension. Judge Hayes remained stoic, his gaze fixed on Eric. "And how does this justify her actions of the night in question?" Eric hesitated for a moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. "It doesn't justify them, Your Honor, but it does provide context. Tanya wasn't speeding out of recklessness or disregard for the law. She was trying to juggle the immense pressure of helping others while ensuring everything went smoothly for an event that could change lives." The judge's pen tapped lightly against the desk, a rhythmic sound that betrayed his inner deliberations. He turned his attention back to Tanya, his expression unreadable. "Miss Jefferson, is what Mr. Daniels says true?" Tanya's voice trembled slightly as she replied, "Yes, Your Honor. Every word. I know I made a mistake that night. I'm not trying to excuse it. But my only intention was to help those who depend on me." The courtroom was silent again, the tension thick in the air. Judge Hayes appeared deep in thought, his eyes flicking between Tanya and Eric, as if weighing the validity of their claims. Then, with a measured tone, he spoke. "Mr. Daniels, while your testimony paints a compelling picture of Miss Jefferson's contributions to society, this is still a court of law. Context is important, but it does not absolve one of accountability." Eric nodded. "I'm not asking for absolution, Your Honor. I'm asking for fairness. And if I may, there's more you should know about Miss Jefferson's impact." The judge gestured for him to continue, though his patience was clearly wearing thin. Eric wasted no time, launching into stories of Tanya's relentless efforts to uplift her community. He spoke of the after-school programs she had founded for at-risk youth, the free health clinics she had coordinated, and the countless hours she had spent mentoring young women who saw her as a role model. As Eric's words filled the room, a new tension began to replace the old. This wasn't just a courtroom drama anymore. It was a reckoning. People were beginning to see Tanya not as a defendant, but as a symbol of resilience and hope. Even the court clerk, who had remained stoic throughout the proceedings, seemed moved by the narrative unfolding before her. Tanya, meanwhile, was grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. Gratitude for Eric's support, fear of the judge's final decision, and a lingering question she couldn't shake. Why had Eric come to her defense? She was certain they had crossed paths before, but she couldn't pinpoint when or where. His presence felt both familiar and mysterious, like a piece of a puzzle she hadn't yet solved. Judge Hayes sighed, his stern facade showing faint cracks. "Mr. Daniels, while I appreciate your perspective, this case isn't about Miss Jefferson's philanthropy. It's about whether or not she broke the law." Before Eric could respond, the judge held up a hand to silence him. "That said, this court does take mitigating circumstances into account when issuing sentences. I will deliberate on this matter further. For now, I suggest we adjourn." With a sharp rap of his gavel, the judge rose from his seat and exited the courtroom. The room erupted into a low hum of whispers and murmurs, the tension finally breaking as people processed what had just transpired. Tanya turned to Eric, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, but why? Why go out of your way to help me?" Eric smiled faintly, a glimmer of something unspoken in his eyes. "You helped me once, though you probably don't remember. This is my way of paying it forward." Before Tanya could respond, he walked away, leaving her with more questions than answers. Who was Eric Daniels, really? And why did she feel like his presence in that courtroom was just the beginning of a story she hadn't fully uncovered? As the courtroom emptied, Tanya lingered near the bench, her mind racing. The judge's decision was still looming, and her future felt uncertain. But one thing was clear: this wasn't just about a fine or a courtroom ruling anymore. Something bigger was at play, something that would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The courtroom felt like a distant memory as Tanya stepped outside, the cool breeze brushing against her face. Despite the fresh air, her mind was heavy with unanswered questions. The mysterious intervention from Eric Daniels had bought her some time, but it had also left her wondering about his motives. She couldn't shake the feeling that their connection went deeper than a passing acquaintance. Back at her modest office, a small but lively space that served as the hub for her community projects, Tanya tried to focus on her work. Papers covered the desk, each representing a different initiative: school supply drives, meal programs, housing assistance. She usually found solace in these tasks, but today her thoughts kept drifting back to Eric. As the hours passed, she decided she couldn't let the questions linger any longer. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found a name that seemed familiar. It was a long shot, but she dialed anyway. "Eric Daniels," a voice answered after a few rings, calm and confident, just as she remembered from the courtroom. "Eric, it's Tanya," she said, hesitating. I don't know if this is appropriate, but I needed to thank you again for speaking up for me. I don't know what would have happened without you." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Tanya wondered if she'd overstepped. Then Eric spoke, his tone warm. "You don't have to thank me, Tanya. You deserved someone to stand up for you. But I had a feeling you might call." Tanya was taken aback. "You did? I figured you'd have questions," Eric said, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. "I would too, if the roles were reversed." She laughed nervously. "You're not wrong. I've been trying to place where I know you from, but I can't. And the way you spoke about me, it's like you've been following my work." Eric chuckled softly. "It's not as mysterious as it sounds. A few years ago, I was in a tough spot. My younger brother got caught up with the wrong crowd, and things spiraled out of control. He was on the verge of dropping out of school, running with kids who didn't care about his future. That's when he found one of your mentorship programs." Tanya froze, the memory slowly surfacing. "Your brother? Marcus." "That's right," Eric confirmed. "You probably don't remember, but you spent weeks working with him. You didn't just talk to him, you showed him a way out. You gave him the tools to believe in himself. Today, he's finishing his degree in engineering. He's thriving because of you." Tanya's heart swelled with a mix of emotions: pride, gratitude, and disbelief. "I had no idea. He was such a bright kid. I'm so glad he's doing well." "That's why I spoke up for you," Eric said. "You gave my family a second chance. The least I could do was remind people who you really are." Tanya was silent for a moment, overwhelmed by the unexpected connection. Finally, she said, "Thank you, Eric. Truly. But I'm still worried about what happens next." The judge, he didn't seem convinced. Eric's voice grew serious. "Judge Hayes is tough, but he's not unreasonable. He's known for taking his time with decisions like this. My guess is he's digging into your history right now, trying to decide if your story holds up." Tanya sighed, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. "I don't know if I can convince him. I've never been good at defending myself. I just do the work." "That's what makes you different, Tanya," Eric said. "But sometimes you have to fight for yourself the way you fight for others. If you need help, I'm here." She thanked him again, her heart lighter, but her mind still racing. As she hung up, she realized Eric's words had planted a seed of determination. For years, she had avoided the spotlight, content to let her actions speak for themselves. But now, faced with a system that demanded proof of her worth, she knew she couldn't stay silent. The next day, Tanya threw herself into her work, but this time with a renewed sense of purpose. She gathered testimonials from people whose lives had been touched by her efforts, compiling stories that showcased the impact of her programs. Mothers who had found stable housing, students who had earned scholarships, elderly residents who no longer went hungry. Each story was a testament to the power of community and the ripple effect of kindness. Meanwhile, Judge Hayes was indeed reviewing her case, as Eric had predicted. Late at night, in the quiet of his study, he pored over reports, letters, and documents related to Tanya's work. He was a man who believed in facts, in evidence, and what he found was difficult to ignore. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of people helped, thousands of dollars raised, countless hours volunteered. But one file caught his attention: a letter from a man who credited Tanya with saving his life. He described a moment when he had hit rock bottom, contemplating the unthinkable, only to have Tanya show up at his door with groceries and an offer of help. The letter ended with a single line: "Asterisk because of her, I'm still here." Asterisk. Judge Hayes leaned back in his chair, the letter still in his hand. He wasn't a man prone to sentimentality, but something about Tanya's story was chipping away at his usual detachment. He would never admit it, but he was beginning to see her not as a defendant, but as a person. A complex, flawed, but undeniably good person. As the court date approached, Tanya prepared herself for whatever lay ahead. She didn't know if her efforts to sway the judge would make a difference, but she was determined to try. And as she stood in her office, surrounded by the evidence of her life's work, she realized something she hadn't before. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone she had ever helped, everyone who believed in her, and everyone who still needed her. The stakes were higher than she had imagined, and the fight was far from over. The day of the final hearing arrived, and the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. The air was heavy, the kind of atmosphere where every creak of a chair or shuffle of papers felt amplified. Tanya sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had spent the last few days preparing herself, gathering every ounce of strength she could muster. Yet, as the moments ticked by, she couldn't shake the pit in her stomach. This wasn't just about her. It was about the work she had poured her heart and soul into, work that could unravel with a single decision. Judge Hayes entered the room, his expression as unreadable as ever. The courtroom rose in unison, and as he took his seat, he glanced briefly in Tanya's direction. It wasn't a look of malice or disdain, but neither was it one of reassurance. His face was a mask of professionalism, a wall that revealed nothing of the deliberations he had undoubtedly wrestled with. As the proceedings began, Tanya's mind raced. She thought about the people who had sent in letters of support, the voices that had risen to speak on her behalf. Eric sat in the gallery, his presence a quiet but powerful reminder that she wasn't alone. His steady gaze gave her something to hold on to, even as doubt clawed at the edges of her resolve. The prosecutor laid out the facts once more, emphasizing the laws that had been broken. There was no embellishment, no theatrics, just a straightforward recounting of events. Tanya knew they weren't wrong. She had made a mistake that night. The question was whether that mistake defined her, or whether her years of service to the community spoke louder. When it was her turn to speak, Tanya rose slowly, her legs feeling heavier than they ever had. She glanced briefly at Judge Hayes, then at the faces in the gallery. She saw neighbors, friends, and even a few people she had helped over the years. Their presence was a comfort, but it also reminded her of the stakes. Clearing her throat, she began to speak. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but soft, "I won't stand here and pretend I didn't make a mistake. I did, but I also believe that mistakes don't erase the good we try to do. They're part of being human, and while I can't undo what happened that night, I can tell you why I was rushing, why I felt so much pressure to get everything right." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. "I've spent my life trying to help people who feel forgotten, who feel like the system isn't built for them. I've seen what happens when we turn away from those in need. And that night, I let the weight of all that responsibility cloud my judgment. I'm not proud of it, but I am committed to doing better." As she spoke, Tanya could feel the room shifting. It wasn't a dramatic change, but there was a subtle softening, a sense that people were truly listening. Even Judge Hayes seemed to lean in slightly, his pen resting motionless on his notepad. She continued, "This work, it's not just what I do, it's who I am. And I know that doesn't absolve me of my actions. But I hope it shows that I'm not just someone who breaks the rules. I'm someone who cares deeply about this community, someone who's trying to make a difference." When she sat down, the silence that followed was deafening. Tanya's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for the judge's response. She had said everything she could, laid herself bare in front of a room full of people. Now, all she could do was hope. Judge Hayes cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Ms. Jefferson," he began, his tone measured, "I've reviewed your case extensively. I've read the letters, the testimonials, and the evidence presented here today. There's no question that your contributions to this community are significant. However, this court is tasked with upholding the law, not rewarding good deeds." Tanya's heart sank, but she kept her composure. She had prepared herself for this, or so she thought. Still, the words stung. The judge continued, "That said, the law also recognizes the importance of context. It acknowledges that each case is unique and must be judged on its own merits. Your situation presents a challenge, a balancing act between accountability and compassion." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "Before I render my decision, I have one question for you Miss Jefferson, if faced with the same circumstances again, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently? Tanya took a deep breath, her mind racing. She knew this was her moment, her chance to prove not just her regret but her growth. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear, I would ask for help. I would remind myself that even when the stakes feel impossibly high, there's no excuse for putting others at risk. I can't promise I'll never make another mistake, but I can promise I've learned from this one. Judge Hayes nodded slowly, as if considering her words carefully. The room was so quiet that Tanya could hear her own heartbeat, a steady drumbeat of anticipation. Every eye was on the judge as he deliberated, the weight of his decision hanging heavy in the air. And then, as if the tension couldn't stretch any further, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A woman stepped inside, her presence causing a ripple of whispers among the spectators. Tanya turned to see who it was and froze. She recognized the woman immediately, Marjorie Allen, a prominent figure in the city's legal circles and a known advocate for criminal justice reform. What was she doing here? And why now? Marjorie walked to the front of the room, her expression calm but determined. She handed a folder to the court clerk, who passed it to Judge Hayes. The judge raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as he opened the folder and began to read. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Tanya watched the judge's face, searching for any sign of what he was thinking. Whatever was in that folder, it had clearly captured his attention. Finally, he set the papers down and looked up. This, he said, his voice breaking the silence, complicates things. The courtroom erupted in a murmur, the suspense reaching a fever pitch. Tanya's mind raced with questions. What was in that folder? How would it affect her case? And most importantly, what would Judge Hayes decide? The answer, she knew, was moments away. Those moments stretched endlessly, leaving her, and everyone else in the room, on the edge of their seats. Judge Hayes tapped his pen against the edge of the desk, the faint sound echoing in the tense silence of the courtroom. He glanced at the folder in front of him, then back at Marjorie Allen, whose presence alone seemed to shift the energy in the room. Tanya could feel the weight of everyone's curiosity pressing in, but she sat still, determined not to let her nerves betray her. This new information, Judge Hayes began, his voice firm but measured, provides additional context to this case. However, it raises questions that require further clarification. He leaned forward, his gaze now fixed on Tanya. Ms. Jefferson, were you aware that your charity's financial records have been flagged for irregularities? The words hit Tanya like a freight train. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment the room seemed to spin. Irregularities, financial records. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She had poured everything into her charity. Every dollar accounted for, every expense meticulously tracked. How could this be? I don't understand. Tanya finally managed, her voice trembling. There must be some mistake. Our finances are reviewed quarterly. Everything is transparent. Judge Hayes raised a hand to silence her. The court is not making accusations at this time, he said, his tone calm but authoritative. But this report suggests that funds may have been misallocated, and given the circumstances, it's a matter that cannot be ignored. Tanya's mind raced. Could this be some kind of misunderstanding? Or worse, could someone have tampered with the records? She thought about her small team, people she trusted implicitly. None of them would ever do something like this, or so she had always believed. Eric leaned forward in the gallery, his expression one of concern mixed with disbelief. He caught Tanya's eye and gave a slight nod, a silent message. Stay strong. But the weight of the new development was almost too much to bear. Not only was her reputation on the line, but now the integrity of her entire organization was being questioned. Marjorie Allen stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady and confident, if I may, I'd like to provide some context regarding these financial records. Judge Hayes gestured for her to proceed. Marjorie turned to face the courtroom, her gaze sweeping over the audience before landing on Tanya. The flagged transactions occurred several months ago and appear to be related to a series of grants allocated to community programs. Upon reviewing the details, it's clear that the funds were used for their intended purposes, but the documentation was incomplete. This kind of oversight is not uncommon in grassroots organizations, especially those operating under significant financial constraints. Tanya felt a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by a gnawing sense of doubt. If the explanation was that simple, why had the issue been brought up now? And by whom? Judge Hayes studied Marjorie carefully. Ms. Allen, are you suggesting this is merely an administrative oversight? I am, Marjorie replied confidently. But I would also recommend an independent audit to ensure full transparency. Ms. Jefferson has built a legacy of trust within this community, and I believe it's in everyone's best interest to clear up any potential misunderstandings. The judge nodded slowly, considering her words. Very well. An audit will be ordered, but in the meantime the court must proceed with the matter at hand. He turned back to Tanya, his expression softening just slightly. Ms. Jefferson, you've built something remarkable. But as you surely understand, even the smallest cracks in a foundation can lead to larger problems. It's your responsibility to address these issues head-on. Tanya swallowed hard, nodding. I understand, Your Honor, and I will do whatever it takes to prove that every dollar has gone toward helping the people we serve. The judge acknowledged her response but didn't linger. Let's move forward, he said, signaling to the bailiff. But before he could continue, another voice cut through the room. Your Honor, if I may address the court. All heads turned toward the back of the room, where a man stood, his presence commanding despite his simple attire. Tanya's heart skipped a beat as she recognized him. Charles Green, a well-known philanthropist and former donor to her organization. What was he doing here? And why now? Judge Hayes seemed equally surprised, but gestured for Charles to approach. You may speak, the judge said, his tone cautious. Charles stepped forward, his gaze steady and focused. I've worked with Miss Jefferson's charity for years, he began, his voice deep and resonant. I've seen firsthand the impact of her work. But I'm here today because I recently received an anonymous email suggesting that funds from my donations were misused. At first, I dismissed it as a baseless claim. But now, given what's been presented, I believe it's worth investigating. The room erupted in whispers, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Tanya's mind reeled. An anonymous email? Who would go to such lengths to undermine her work? And why now, when she was already under scrutiny? Judge Hayes called for order, his gavel striking the wooden desk with a sharp crack. Mr. Green, he said, his tone firm, do you have any evidence to support these allegations? Charles hesitated, then handed a printed document to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Tanya watched helplessly as Judge Hayes scanned the paper, his expression unreadable. Every second felt like an eternity, the suspense building to an almost unbearable level. Finally, the judge set the paper down and looked up, his eyes meeting Tanya's. This, he said slowly, raises even more questions. The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on Tanya like a storm about to break. She glanced at Eric, who looked equally stunned, and then back at the judge. Whatever was in that document, it had just escalated the stakes in ways she couldn't have imagined. And as the tension in the room reached its peak, Tanya realized that the fight for her reputation and her future was far from over. The courtroom was silent, a collective breath held as Judge Hayes carefully folded the document and placed it on the bench. Tanya's heart raced, her mind whirling with 1,000 questions. What was in that paper? How had her work, her life, come to this moment of complete uncertainty? She clenched her hands tightly in her lap, willing herself to stay composed as the judge cleared his throat. Miss Jefferson, he began, his voice measured, the document provided raises serious concerns, but it does not conclusively implicate you in any wrongdoing. However, it does point to the need for a thorough investigation into the financial management of your organization. This court cannot ignore the gravity of these allegations, nor can it make assumptions without clear evidence. Tanya nodded, her chest tightening. She was innocent, But how could she prove it when even her own supporters seemed to be questioning her? She glanced at Eric, whose steady gaze offered a glimmer of reassurance. She reminded herself that the truth would prevail, because it had to. Marjorie Allen stepped forward again, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I would like to request that the court allow Miss Jefferson time to conduct an independent audit and provide full transparency regarding her charity's finances. I believe this would demonstrate her commitment to accountability while preserving the integrity of her work." Judge Hayes considered her words carefully. "That is a reasonable request," he said finally. "Miss Jefferson, you will have 30 days to produce a comprehensive audit of your organization's financial records. In the meantime, this court will defer any further rulings on your case. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Tanya replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. She had been given a lifeline, but the battle was far from over. As the judge prepared to adjourn the session, Charles Green rose from his seat once more. "Your Honor, if I may," he said, his tone urgent. The judge raised an eyebrow, but gestured for him to speak. "There's something I need to say," Charles continued, turning to face the courtroom. "I've been silent for too long, but I can't in good conscience let this proceed without revealing what I know." Tanya's stomach dropped. What now? She watched as Charles hesitated, his face a mixture of regret and determination. "The anonymous email I received," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "was not from a concerned party. It was sent by someone within the charity, someone who had a personal vendetta against Miss Jefferson. And I have proof." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and Tanya felt her breath catch in her throat. A personal vendetta. Her mind raced, trying to piece together who could possibly harbor such resentment. She had always treated her team like family, trusting them implicitly. The idea that one of them could betray her was almost too much to bear. Charles handed another document to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Hayes. The judge scanned the paper, his expression darkening with each passing moment. Finally, he looked up, his gaze fixed on Charles. "This is a serious accusation," he said. "Do you have any corroborating evidence?" Charles nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I have email correspondence and financial statements that show funds were intentionally misallocated by a member of Ms. Jefferson's team to make it appear as though she was at fault. It was a calculated effort to discredit her." The room erupted in whispers, and Tanya felt the weight of the revelation crash over her. Betrayal, anger, relief, it all mingled together in a storm of emotions. She looked at Charles, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Who?" she managed to whisper, though the word was barely audible. Judge Hayes called for order, his gavel striking the bench with force. "Miss Jefferson," he said, "it seems we had more questions to answer. Do you have any idea who might be responsible for this?" Tanya shook her head, her mind a blur, but even as she denied it, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. There was only one person who had access to the level of detail required to pull off something like this. A person she had trusted implicitly. Someone who had been by her side from the beginning. The courtroom doors swung open, and all eyes turned to see a woman standing in the doorway, Rachel, Tanya's longtime assistant. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a folder to her chest. She stepped forward, her movements hesitant but purposeful. "I need to confess," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent, the tension so thick, it was almost suffocating. Tanya stared at Rachel, her heart breaking as the woman she had trusted so deeply began to speak. I did it," Rachel admitted, her voice cracking. "I was the one who altered the financial records and sent the email to Mr. Green. I thought," she paused, her voice choking on the words. "I thought if I could make it look like Tanya was mismanaging the funds, I could take over the charity. I thought I could do better." Tanya's breath caught in her throat, the betrayal cutting deeper than she ever thought possible. Rachel, the woman who had stood by her side through countless challenges, had been the one to orchestrate this entire nightmare. Judge Hayes' expression was stern as he addressed Rachel. "Do you understand the gravity of your actions?" he asked, his voice cold. I do, Rachel said, tears streaming down her face. I was wrong, and I'm ready to face the consequences. The room was silent as the weight of Rachel's confession sank in. Tanya felt a mix of anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of relief. The truth was out. Her name would be cleared, but the cost of that truth was almost too much to bear. Judge Hayes sighed, his tone softening just slightly as he addressed the room. This case has revealed not just the flaws in our systems, but the complexities of human nature. Ms. Jefferson, your work speaks for itself, and I trust that you will continue to serve this community with integrity. As for Ms. Rachel, the court will address her actions in a separate hearing. Tanya nodded, her emotions too overwhelming for words. As the courtroom emptied, she remained seated, her thoughts racing. The battle was over, but the scars it left behind would take time to heal. And as she stepped out into the bright sunlight, she made a silent vow to rebuild, to rise above, and to never let betrayal dim her commitment to making a difference.